And we go straight on to the first point on the agenda, a statement by the Vice President of the Commission, the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. She is represented today by the Vice President of the Commission, Mr. Stylianides. I hope you're very welcome here to talk to us about the Turkish military operation in northeast Syria and its consequences. As you know, we have a new system for catch the eye and blue cards. I don't need to keep reminding you of that. You can either use the traditional form of the blue card or you can use the electronic form. You don't need to wait till the end of the debate to ask to take the floor and to catch the eye. That brings me straight to the debate. Once again, can I welcome the Commission representative of the Council, rather. Ms. Stylianides, can you give us the position of Council, please?
Guten Morgen, sehr geehrter
Good morning, President.
Parliament. The Turkish incursion into northeast Syria seems to having slowed down. We acknowledge the contribution made by several international actors to ensure that this is the case. We have seen high-level diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalating tensions, first by the United States Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo a few days ago, who negotiated a temporary truce with Turkey. We also note the memorandum signed only yesterday between President Putin and President Erdogan in Sochi. The High Representative was in the Parliament with you on the first day of the offence, and she immediately made clear our request that Turkey immediately stop the attack. Turkey's concerns must be addressed diplomatically, not through a military action that can only further destabilise the region and bring more suffering to the Syrian population. We are also relieved that humanitarian agencies have not had to suspend their response, at least not entirely, and that those displaced from their homes for fear of the fighting have begun to return too. Yet there can be no excuse for the nearly 200 civilian deaths that have occurred, nor for the bombing of hospitals, ambulances and water stations. We care about the fate of Syrian Kurds, and indeed for all the civilians in the zone of hostilities. The only way to address their aspirations and to recognise the sacrifice made by the Syrian democratic forces in the fight against Daesh is to help build a democratic and inclusive Syria, a country that all its citizens can call home. There can be no military solution to the Syrian conflict. It is crucial that instead we support the political process and that a lasting solution is found for all parties involved. Thus, we have to support the work of the Constitutional Committee, due to meet for the first time at the end of the month in Geneva. Despite recent events, or rather, all the more so because of them, the time is right for that committee to meet. We have full confidence in the United Nations Special Envoy Geir Pedersen, and we believe that a step-by-step political solution can be found. Launching the Constitutional Committee can set a positive cycle of trust and confidence and eventually bring about the changes necessary for a peaceful and stable future for Syria. We all know that the path towards a negotiated political transition will not be easy. Yet we must agree with our international partners, and yes, Russia and Turkey too, that changes must be made to the way Syria is governed. We must agree that justice and accountability must be brought for the crimes committed by all sides during the course of that conflict, right up to Idlib and the most recent offensive. This is for the sake of the peace, stability and reconciliation that we all crave for Syria. Let me turn now to Turkey and its responsibility for the current situation. Turkey's security concerns at its border with Syria will not be answered by the military intervention. This offensive instead undermines the fight against Daesh and threatens our common security. Turkey has made tremendous efforts in hosting several million refugees for many years. There's no doubt about that. Yet, Turkey's military action is only making an already highly complex situation in the region even more difficult to resolve. It only adds to an already complex and dramatic situation. This is why the EU leaders and EU foreign ministers have condemned Turkey's incursion, and this is also why member states have decided to halt arms exports licensing to Turkey. We insist that the incursion must not just be stopped temporarily, but it must cease altogether. The Foreign Affairs Council has also made clear that we will not provide stabilisation or development assistance in areas where the rights of local populations are ignored or violated. The European Union has been clear and united on all this from the very first day of the incursion. We are glad that the Council, the Commission and Parliament have passed the very same messages, and we thank the European Parliament for its continued support to ending the war and supporting a political solution under the United Nations auspices. Thank you, Mr. President.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Commission, Vice President, Mr. Stylianides.
Dear President, dear colleagues, thank you very much for the opportunity to update you on the recent humanitarian development in northeast Syria. The crisis that unfolded on 9 October has led to civilian casualties, displacement of people, destruction of civilian infrastructure. Heavy fighting took place, including in highly populated areas. There are reports of nearly 200 civilian deaths. At the height of the hostilities, nearly 200,000 people have been displaced. Some have now started coming home, but the remaining over 150,000 displaced people come in addition to over 200,000 people that were already in camps and informal sites or hosting arrangements before the crisis. Humanitarian staff were denied safe and unbeaten access to people in need due to shelling and airstrikes or uncertainty regarding territorial control. International NGOs and UN agencies had to evacuate staff to Iraq. Now, let me underline that what the EU President has just said. There can be no excuse for these civilian deaths, damage to civilian infrastructure, absence of protection of people and those who are there to help them. I'm particularly concerned about the horrific situation faced by healthcare providers. Hospitals in Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain are out of services due to heavy bombing and shelling. Kobane Hospital was temporarily out of service because the electricity line and the generators were cut by mortars, and because of shelling, ambulances have been reportedly targeted, preventing the evacuation of patients from the front lines. Medical staff has been killed and even kidnapped. To make matters worse, the emergency is affecting the provision of basic services to a population that was already suffering before the crisis. While the international staff was evacuated, this does not mean that the humanitarian community is no longer assisting the people in need. Life-saving assistance continues to be delivered. We are supporting our humanitarian partners in northeast Syria with €38 million, and we will continue to support them for as long as is needed. But the fighting must stop, and it remains paramount that international humanitarian law is fully respected and that civilians are protected. Humanitarian workers must be allowed access to those in need. All precautions must be taken to mitigate the risk of harming aid workers, their facilities and assets, including convoys and the people they serve. Humanitarian workers should not be any sort of target. Let me also take this opportunity to recall the EU's line with regards to the return of refugees to Syria. All returns should be safe, voluntary and dignified, and only once the conditions are in place. Otherwise, the European Union will not be in a position to provide support. The same applies to the so-called buffer zones that Turkey is seeking to establish in the north of Syria with a view to eventually sending refugees back. And let me also recall the recent EU 28 statement that any attempt of demographic change will be unacceptable. At the same time, the European Union will not provide stabilisation or development assistance in areas where the rights of local population are ignored. Dear colleagues, the European Commission has recognised and supported the efforts of Turkey to host millions of refugees in its territory. But Turkey's military action in north-east Syria has aggravated an already traumatic situation on the ground. I am glad that the European institutions have been united in their reaction against Turkey's military action. But there should be no time for complacency. The broad ceasefire was only partially respected. We must use all our power, all our leverage to stop hostilities, to put an end to this humanitarian tragedy, and to allow our assistance to fully resume. And of course, reach in parallel a political solution under the UN. Thank you, President.
Danke, Herr Kommissar.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gahler, 1.5 minutes.
President.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President. Well, in this House there is a wide-ranging consensus. We fully criticise what's going on in northern Syria, and we would like to see a withdrawal of Turkish troops from Syrian territory. We're not naive. We know what was agreed yesterday in Sochi, and we regret that this situation was made possible by a unilateral withdrawal of American troops. Turkey is moving even further away from the European Union politically, and that's why in our resolution we recalled that this Parliament already in March called for the suspension of accession talks with Turkey. We would like the Council to reflect on appropriate targeted economic measures that don't affect the civilian population. That, for example, don't stop Turkish students taking part in Erasmus+. We have, for example, an agreement on agricultural products, and perhaps we could reflect on whether something could be done there. We've also mentioned that as a final resort, we could suspend the customs union. The people in this northern Syrian region don't want the Turks or the Russians or the Assad regime there, and that's why in our resolution we have asked
again turn to the UN Security Council to obtain a resolution which will allow the Council to act in a targeted manner, ultimately aiming at a UN-led security zone in northern Syria for the benefit of the people living there. Vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Nun ist Frau Kati-Piri am Wort.
Dear colleagues, 2 weeks have passed since our last plenary session and our debate on this crisis. The establishment of a so-called safe zone has de facto become the establishment of a war zone and a Turkish invasion of northeast Syria. The winners are Putin, Assad, Turkey, Iran and ISIS. And the losers are the citizens of northeast Syria and the credibility of the West. A total of 218 civilians and 600 SDF fighters have been killed. More than 300,000 civilians had to leave their homes and are now displaced, struggling to find safety. They are caught between advancing Turkish troops and Syrian forces moving in from the south. And hundreds of IS fighters, including EU citizens, have escaped guarded camps. The summary execution of Kurdish politician Hevrin Kalaf, one of the many courageous women in northeast Syria, is an absolute outrage. The latest reports refer also to the alleged use of white phosphorus against civilians by Turkish-backed forces in Ras Al Ain. The perpetrators of these heinous acts must be prosecuted. And while the US President hails the ceasefire as a great news that will save millions of lives, I can only reject, on behalf of this House, its very basic premise. Yesterday's Russian-Turkey deal legitimizes the Turkish presence of a 10-kilometer zone along the Syrian border, the refoulement of 2 million refugees and the displacement of local population. All of these are grave violations of the most basic principles of international law, refugee law and humanitarian law. We have called for targeted sanctions against Turkish officials, restrictive economic measures and a full weapons embargo. And beyond any legal and political consideration, I wish to underline that abandoning all those who suffered from ISIS and who fought against ISIS, making the ultimate sacrifice for our own security, is not and should never be an option. Thank you.
Danke, Frau Kollegin Piri.
Thank Ms. Piri. Mr. Osmani Malik.
Mr. Chair, the Turkish military operation in northeastern Syria is cause for a great concern and is leading to chaos in the region. Reports speak of hundreds of casualties, hundreds of thousands of displaced people, and even of executions. ISIS terrorists have escaped prison, and as a direct result of the Turkish move and the US withdrawal. A revival of ISIS and the possible return of these terrorists to European soil presents also an immediate safety threat for our societies, for our citizens. By asking questions to the European Commission, by sending a letter to the High Representative Ms. Mogherini, which was widely supported by more than 250 colleagues, and I'm grateful for that, and by engaging with the Turkish authorities, I have in the past weeks attempted, on behalf of Renew Europe, to contribute to ending this violence. But so far, the EU's response has not been strong enough. We cannot just stand by and see how others interfere. For example, Russia, Assad, Iran. It's also our safety that is at stake. For New Europe, the road does not end here. Tomorrow, the European Parliament has the unique opportunity to speak with one clear voice. One voice to make perfectly clear to Turkey that we do not accept this. And to call upon the EU to take a strong stance now. I ask my colleagues in this House to support me in urging the High Representative to set up an immediate dialogue with the Turkish authority, to reach a sustainable solution and to hold Erdogan to his promise of keeping IS prisoners in detention. However, we must be prepared for a firmer action. Arms, economic and target sanctions are also on the table. Let us combine our strengths and show unity and bring an end to the violence now. We owe it to the people in the region and to our European citizens. Please, Commission, get off the sideline and act. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Frau Tineke-Strick.
Thank you, Chair. Exactly 2 weeks ago, Turkey began a planned military offensive in northeast Syria. And 2 weeks in which many civilians have been killed, nearly 200,000 Syrians were forced to flee their homes, and among them are 80,000 children in desperate need of aid and shelter, while humanitarian organizations were forced to leave the country. The situation in Syria is again a humanitarian tragedy which should not continue any other day. The withdrawal of the US troops has left the Syrian and Kurdish people with no other options than to wait for the solution Erdogan and Putin will come up with. And although the EU should use its power to de-escalate the conflict and stop the violence, it seems to be invisible at the world stage. And therefore today the Greens call upon the EU to take up its role as a proactive actor, to force Erdogan to withdraw its troops and refrain from deporting Syrian refugees back to Syria, by placing targeted sanctions and visa bans on Turkish government officials, imposing a full arms embargo, and by working on suspension of the trade agreements. At the same time, we should proactively protect the Syrian refugees by stepping up their resettlement and take our fair share in their protection. We cannot wait any longer with action, and we therefore urge the support for the proposed resolution. Chair, ISIS terrorists escape displacement camps, posing a risk to the Syrian people and leaving us with no control over their prosecution. The Greens therefore urge the EU member states to repatriate their nationals and their family members, to prosecute them at home and take care of their children. It's our duty to reduce the security risks and also to prevent children from being the victims. And as we all know, one of the goals of Erdogan's invasion is to deport Syrian refugees to their country. However, even a so-called safe zone cannot protect them against violence and persecution. As deportation would violate the Refugee Convention, the EU must refrain from returning Syrian refugees to Turkey as long as this risk of deportation exists. But deportation would also mean a demographic change of the population in northeast Syria, which is also a crime against humanity. As the Kurds who fought on our side will probably lose their autonomy, the EU should at least make all efforts to ensure that their rights are upheld. So high time to be proactive. Thank you.
Thank you. Herr Berg, Klaus Patrick.
Ich bin traurig.
Thank you. I'm sad, though not surprised, that the ceasefire has not been stuck to. Thousands of people have been killed. The Kurdish people were betrayed after the Kurds fought the IS for us. We left the Kurds to their own devices in their hour of need. Obviously, we heard the threats from Mr. Erdogan, including that he'd send millions of asylum seekers to Europe, thus ensuring instability in European countries. We've got to be very clear. We should have no more accession negotiations with Turkey. It's clear that Turkey's behavior is contrary to peace and the rule of law. It's weakened us all. It has led to the release of terrorists, and that means that the whole region and also the European countries are in great danger. To get together with Qatar, Turkey has been supporting IS, which is one of the most dangerous organizations which threatens our whole society. So clear message, Mr. Erdogan, Turkey is not part of Europe.
Thank you, President. Numerous mistakes have been made by the international community in Syria since 2011. We have to remember atrocities of Assad regime, Aleppo, presence of Iranian Revolutionary Guard backing Assad regime, and cruel Wagner group of Russian mercenaries that was so well known in eastern Ukraine. We are concerned by recent operation, third in line of Turkey in northeastern Syria. I would like to quote Stoltenberg, the statement as probably the most balanced one. While Turkey has legitimate security concerns, I expect the country to act with restraint. And all of us, we expect this restraint, certainly. Yet, we have to know that equal measures should be applied to all actors in the region, and we have to find adequate tools to stabilize the region and influence activities that ease the tension. Thank you.
Unsere nächste Rednerin ist
Our next speaker is Mrs. Demirel Isler. Thank you very much, President. My children wanted to fight. I let them fight, and then I've separated them. That's what Donald Trump said. I mean, this is really disgusting and shows what kind of a person is speaking there. People are dying. People are fleeing. The incursion of the Turkish army should be condemned unequivocally. No country can simply march into another country. These are geopolitical reasons, the so-called safe zone, but actually this isn't about safety, it's about reshaping Syria. But the fact is that all world powers, including the EU, simply look to their own geopolitical and economic interests while international law was broken and war crimes were committed. We haven't even got a genuine arms embargo here. Erdogan couldn't continue with his war if the international community spoke out clearly and jointly and put political and economic pressure on Erdogan. What we want is a genuine weapons embargo. We want no more business with the AKP. We want the recognition of independent structures in Rojava. There needs to be a political and peaceful solution for the region, not a military solution. Rojava is an example of this. The Kurdish and democratic forces are progressive forces. They supported us, and while people follow their geopolitical interests, the local people want democracy and freedom. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Radakovsky, please.
Odsuzujem tureckú agresiu v severnej Sýrii.
Thank you. I condemn the Turkish aggression in Syria without any mandate from the EU and from the UN rather, and without the agreement of Syria. This aggression must come up against the hardest condemnation from the EU. This is going to lead to streams of terrorists to Europe. If the EU doesn't want to be a political dwarf, it's got to withdraw the sanctions that were imposed on Syria, start diplomatic relations with Syria, and not interfere in internal matters of Syria. We should condemn the presence of
Say that I'm not.
all foreign powers in Syria.
Chomsky, please.
Zu Wort gemeldet ist Herr Halicki.
Mr. Halicki now, please.
Narodowi kurdyjskiemu jesteśmy.
President, we should show solidarity with the Kurdish nation, and hopefully we will adopt this resolution tomorrow. The Kurdish people fought so that the West could call victory over ISIS. They fought with the ISIS in a number of cities that they liberated in Syria. Today we propose a budgetary amendment to freeze pre-accession funds, paragraph 45, and to shift these funds to reserve. We cannot reduce funds for the civic society, but this budgetary amendment will show our position and the fact that we do not agree to massacre the Kurdish people.
Herr Pizzula.
Mr. Pizzula.
Voilà.
Thank you. While we are talking about the consequences of the military intervention in Syria, the agreement between USA and Turkey has expired, but now we have another one between Turkey and Russia, so opposing sides when the integrity of Syria is brought into question. It seems that this agreement is not acceptable for either of the sides. But what about the Kurdish fighters who really gave their contribution against ISIS? And what about the Kurdish fighters that the Western countries don't want to take responsibilities for? And what about the local population that is not included in this agreement? I think that the main target must be the ceasefire of military operations, and we mustn't just observe this agreement. I definitely support the sanctions, the ban on the export of weapons, and all economic sanctions that we can apply. But how can we expect strategic decisions of the European Union in Syria where we couldn't make these decisions when we didn't have unanimity in the accession negotiations with Northern Macedonia and Albania?
Danke, Herr Kollege.
Thank you. Mrs. Woutmans now, please.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter.
Thank you very much, President, colleagues. Erdogan really wants to shake our will. He's taken Europe hostage in a way. Back in 2016, we had our own, we set up this policy and we provided funds, and he's got the keys in his hand. And he can open up the gates and let the migrants go. He's trying to look for a safe zone, that is what he's saying, but we all know that he really wants to fight the Kurds. Where is Europe? That's what people are asking. What is Europe doing to stop this bloody conflict? Well, Europe is just looking on. It's looking on. Putin is supporting Assad's dictatorial regime. And looking at the Americans fleeing. Europe is just looking on as Turkey, with all sorts of pretexts, is just making the situation worse. We are just observers. We're the people who have to bear the brunt. We're the people who are going to have to deal with the flows of migrants. Our young people are the people who radicalize and go to that part of the world. It's time for action, colleagues. We have to really ensure that the safe zone is controlled by the UN. That is what we want. Europe has got to take on its own security policy. We can't depend on the Americans or the Russians. So this is why I think that we should take into account more than 700 children, European children, in the camps. They should not pay for the sins of their parents. We need a European defence union and a proper European asylum policy.
Danke.
Thank you. Mr. Lagodinsky, please.
Elder men got together in Moscow.
Kaks hallipäist meest said kokku ja otsustasid ühe piirkonna ära jagada. Kaks hallipäist vanameest said seda teha ainult sellepärast, et meie ebaõnnestusime, sest meie institutsioonid on ebaõnnestunud, sest meie parlament on ebaõnnestunud, sest nõukogu on oma eesmärgid täitmata jätnud ja komisjon samuti. Kus on laiaulatuslikud relvaembargod, kus on sihitud sanktsioonid, millest me oleme rääkinud? Meie ei suutnud võtta vastutust selle regiooni eest ja teised tegid seda.
Can develop into a political actor. Abolish unanimous decisions on foreign policy. Invest into more diplomacy and more foreign policy ability of the European Union. We have 5 years to do so, maybe not now, not to help those people, and we are ashamed of it, but let's change in the upcoming 5 years. And if you want to prevent elder, grey-haired men to decide about the fate of the world, let's invest also into a feminist foreign policy, so that we have more women to decide about the future of the world. And one more thing I want to mention. There is a consensus here, as Mr. Gala said. There are various political powers and political forces voting for a very harsh resolution. But they are doing so for various political reasons. And I can tell you what our reason is to vote for those harsh words. We want to secure a European future for Turkey. And in order to secure a European future for Turkey, we must tame Turkish imperialism of the government. We must tame the Turkish anti-humanitarian militarism of this government, because the European future of Turkey are the civilians, are the artists, are many people who are in prison now, and for them it is worth fighting for this future. For those who are saying that we want to prevent it, that they want to vote for this resolution to prevent a future for Turkey in Europe, we are saying quite clear. We are voting for this harsh resolution in order to allow a future for those people, a future in democracy and a future in Europe. Against Erdogan, but for Europe.
Danke. Am Wort ist Herr
Thank you, Mr. Ivan David.
Vážený pane předsedo,
Chairman, I am reluctant to vote in favor of the resolution the way it looks now. Because what was strong in that resolution was cancelled, and articles were added that I cannot agree with. It's basically too late and too little. It's the Kurds, and it will be the Kurds who will suffer, who will bring sacrifices. And the worst of all is that this is based on the Adana agreement, in which both Syria and Turkey labeled the Kurds as terrorists. It's the Kurds who take credit for the destruction of the IS in its previous form. And Europe once again shows its weakness and reluctance to act. It's only the economic blockade that can change things on the ground.
Frau Asita Kanko.
Mrs. Kanko, please.
When I was a child, if someone would say that the Americans will come and save us, I actually tended to believe because of American movies. I don't know if we were right, and I don't know if today would be wrong. If I was a child again, and someone would say, wait, Europe will come and save you, maybe I'll start saving myself. Europe has chosen for diplomacy as a powerful tool, and I think this is very beautiful. Diplomacy, indeed, is a powerful tool, but only when the person across the table knows you are willing to act. We must show that when it comes to ensuring global stability, the EU is not a talking shop, but a beacon of hope for those fighting for freedom, for their lives. We should halt licenses for arms exports to Turkey and consider putting in place economic sanctions. We must push for a no-fly zone in northeast Syria and call for peace talks to be resumed with the involvement of Kurdish representation. We should put an immediate block on European pre-accession aid and guarantee humanitarian assistance in the region. For those displaced and in harm's way, while some world leaders seek to retreat from their responsibilities in the Middle East, this is the time for the EU to step forward and also have special attention to women suffering a lot of abuse over there. Thank you.
Merci. Herr Kollege Willems.
Thank you. Mr. Willemsen, please.
Amina Madini, 73 år gammel.
Mini Fafini, 73 years old, killed by a grenade. Mohammed Yusuf Hussein, 11 years old, killed by a grenade. Ibrahim al-Musaf, 3 years old, seriously wounded in the leg. Hussein Ali Klein, 2 years old, seriously burnt. The list of victims of the Erdogan invasion in southeast Syria is long, horribly long. Turkish military and militias have executed civilians in the open street, bombed cities, and are being accused of the use of chemical weapons. We've seen how Trump has let down allies, our allies in Syria. We've seen how Erdogan has continued while the EU did nothing. And yesterday we saw Putin and Erdogan meet in Russia and decide how they want to share the spoils of Syria. While we're standing around talking, Turkish and Russian forces are planning to invade and preparing to invade Christian and Syrian centers. This is ethnic cleansing. If we impose sanctions, then Turkish economy will collapse and the invasion will stop. We can stop Erdogan if we have the political will. My dear colleagues, it is time to act.
Thank you. Mr. Constantinu now.
Ladies and gentlemen, in continuation to the previous information on the operation of Turkey in northern Syria, and according to what we hear in the international media, I would like to note as follows. The military operation of Turkey against the Kurdish forces has already caused massive displacement. We've seen various references to indiscriminate attacks against civilians. These attacks are war crimes. This is what the American Defense Secretary, Mr. Esper, said as well. I would also like to stress James Jeffrey's declaration that dozens of jihadists of the IS were liberated after the advance of the Turkish military in northern Syria. So the Union institutions should be very clear in their views and do something about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes. Mr. McAllister.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the Turkish military operation in northeastern Syria is yet another devastating event in an extremely tragic conflict. It has serious humanitarian, military and political repercussions. It causes suffering for the local people, and it may contribute to a resurgence of Islamic terrorism. I would like to underline what colleagues, especially the group coordinators of EPP, S&D and ALDE, have mentioned this morning. Colleagues, I would like to inform you that this week, in my capacity as chair of AFET, I published, together with the chairs of the Foreign Affairs Committees of Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and also the US House of Representatives, a joint statement on the Turkish invasion. In our letter, we consider the abandonment of the Syrian Kurds to be wrong, as the Syrian Democratic Forces massively contributed to the successful yet unfinished fight against Daesh in Syria. We deeply regret the decision of the President of the United States to withdraw American troops from northeastern Syria, and we call upon the European Union and the Member States to take responsibility and engage in the conflict resolution. In our draft resolution that will be voted tomorrow, we also call for a strong and comprehensive EU reaction to this ongoing crisis. Colleagues, a final remark. I welcome initiatives to establish an internationally controlled security zone in northeast Syria. Such a zone could stabilize the region and make sure that rebuilding civilian life is possible again. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Sanchez Amor.
Ευχαριστώ, Πρόεδρε. Όπως είπε το Συμβούλιο και είναι και η θέση της ομάδας μας, αυτή η στρατιωτική επέμβαση της Τουρκίας είναι σαφής παραβίαση του διεθνούς δικαίου. Επιπλέον, είναι ιδιαίτερα παράδεκτη. Το διεθνές δίκαιο όμως είναι το πλαίσιο για όλους μας. Με συγχωρείτε. Με σας παρακαλώ. Πρώτα απ' όλα να μιλήσετε λίγο.
Can you hear the English? Yes, okay, thank you.
So, apologies for the interruption, and if you wouldn't mind just speaking a little slower for the interpreters.
It's okay, madam? Okay, thank you.
As the Council has stated, and it's my group's position as well, the Turkish military operation in northern Syria is a clear violation of international law. There are all kinds of political things that we could say, but that is the main point. International law is a framework for everyone, and that is what the European Union has used to establish a path to peace and the reconstruction of the country. So none of the concerns that Turkey may have in terms of security justifies the military invasion of a neighbouring country. That is not a solution. It simply just prolongs the problem. Turkey is a member of NATO and can call for solidarity from its allies, but it cannot act outside the multilateral framework. Maintaining a huge number of Syrian refugees is not an excuse for invading a neighbour either. The fact that it says it is defending the territorial integrity of its neighbour by occupying it is clearly not true. It's interfering in complex demographic and ethnic balance situations. The military force that is invading this area is problematic. No one can invade. The only possible thing that can be done is the voluntary repatriation of Syrian families. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam von Wiese.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At the time of the Turkish invasion, about 7,000 children of ISIS fighters lived in camps in northern Syria. Among them, about 700 EU citizens. Many were forced to flee, and their fate is now unknown. We cannot abandon these children or punish them for the crimes of their parents. No child under 10 is criminally liable in any EU member state. I call on member states today to comply with international, European and national laws and repatriate these children now, before it is too late. Thank you.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes, Madam Brickmore.
Je vous invite, Mesdames.
Madam President, colleagues, could I ask you just to close your eyes for a minute and listen to what I am saying. You have children, and your oldest son leaves Belgium or whatever country and goes off to fight. And you fight back. You fight like a lion to get him back. But nothing doing. There's a lack of political will. Your grandchildren are born in this situation of war and deplorable humanitarian conditions. Your son dies eventually. The son that you've been fighting to get back since you've been a member of parliament. And then again, you fight hard for your grandchildren who are the victims of a war they did not choose to go into. You fight to get them back to Europe, to a safe place. Today, as a politician, you have the power to get those children back to the European Union, and the European Union can coordinate that action. So in the name of the interest of the children, which should prevail, which is enshrined in the International Charter of the Rights of the Child, and which we must all respect, this is what should happen.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Mariani.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, President. A year ago, I wrote on Twitter, at the end of history, the only person or the only people who can protect the Kurds against the Turks is Assad. You might be surprised, but it was all very predictable. Because how could you possibly doubt that the Kurds would be left to their own devices by those people who said that they would stand by them? How could we doubt that President Trump, who'd already said that he would withdraw American troops, would do so? How could we have any doubt that the reaction from Turkey would be what it is? I'm not here to defend Turkey. I condemn the fact that they have invaded Syria, but what country would accept having groups of terrorists just across the border and regularly invading, making incursions? We needed to how can we justify the sanctions that the European Union still has on medical materials? The conclusions of this history, what is it? Well, we have a vision of the security and the humanitarian approach, whereas we should have had a strategic vision, as other countries have. And the result is that we're spectators. We just stand by, deplore, vote on resolutions, but we have never really done anything. We've never been a player. Thank you.
Minute, Mr. Turch.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. The Turkish invasion of Syria is certainly a tragedy, but it was a predictable tragedy because Turkey has interests in the region, serious ones, and the 3.5 million refugees that they have are a clear fact that is something that we haven't thought about until what is happening now started to happen. I think that we have to put pressure on Turkey, of course, to not go too far and to ensure that there are protected and exclusion zones established. But Turkey isn't interested in a Pax Putinesca in northern Syria over the long term, because that would only be in the interests of Russia and Iran. Europe, I think, can only lament what's happened and lick its wounds, because we have done absolutely nothing. We just assumed that the Americans would be there with money and troops forever, but that shows a genuine, massive lack of realism, which is something that we constantly see in Europe. There's no future to that way of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Georgiou, for 1 minute, please.
You, the European leaders, the leaders of the European Union, you remember when you supported the Arab Spring. Now that there's a heavy winter in the region, you pour crocodile tears on the ruins. 8 years ago, there was an incursion against the Syrian government by foreign powers. They wanted to dismember the country. The US, NATO, Turkey and EU countries and Persian Gulf monarchies armed the hordes of jihadis and the Islamic State. Now, with the tolerance, with the acceptance by Russia and the US, and with just words from the EU, Erdogan, as a beast, is trying once again to drink the blood of the Kurds and to wipe out the Kurds without any restraint. The only aim is to redistribute the oil, to sell arms, and to curve the region, to curve it up. So this might seem contradictory, but we are tragic. That's all I have to say.
Mr. Castaldo, for 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Colleagues. In less than a month, Erdogan violated international law by invading Syria. He started ethnic cleansing, as Amnesty International has said. This is really a shameful lack of appreciation of civilian life, and he violated many human rights and perpetrated war crimes. So, unfortunately, not all member states, but some have finally stopped exporting arms to Ankara. But this is not enough. We really have to stop this crazy accession procedure of Turkey to the Union. The premises for this no longer exist. And any European finance which could end up in Erdogan's pockets must stop. We can't shove everything under the Turkish carpet. The problem of the migratory flows are a type of scarecrow used to frighten us and to stop us from speaking out. We must use the whole panoply of initiatives at our disposal. We've got sanctions which we can take, trade sanctions and the like vis-à-vis Turkey. Now, we've made mistakes in the past, dear colleagues, and they're blatant to everybody. They're obvious. Let's not abandon the Kurdish people yet again. At least we Europeans should defend them.
For 1 minute.
Vă mulțumesc, domnule președinte.
President, the Turkey invasion in northeastern Syria has two parts to it. One part is security. Turkey thinks that the Kurd militia are terrorists, and then the second part is humanitarian and linked to migration. The effects of this invasion are extremely serious. The Syrian army, for the first time in very many years, is in the north of Syria. This has made it impossible for Turkey to control the whole of the border. Turkey has to be content with 120 out of more than 400 kilometers. This invasion has led to displacement. 170,000 people over a few days only, and 100 people have been killed. Finally, the invasion means that Turkey can give guarantees on the future of Syria. In other words, can extend its influence to Syria. Sorry. We say that we don't want to export arms, but the problem is he'll just buy arms from Putin.
Securitate la frontiera turco-siriana.
A security zone should be allowed at the border between Turkey and Syria.
Speakers, and I'm being a little flexible because it's a really important debate, but really we can't take double our time when we speak. And we now move to our next speaker, Madam Santos, for 1.5 minutes. Thank you.
Obrigada, Senhora Presidente. Este é daqueles momentos.
Thank you, President. Well, it's one of those times when you cannot be silent. You have to speak out. This Turkish military offensive is a serious violation of international law. It threatens the peace and stability of the region and is forcing many refugees to move out of the region. It also opens the door to ISIS. So we can only firmly condemn what's being done. An arms embargo would be one way of acting, of course, but it's not enough. The embargo needs to be extended to all forms of supplies, and there need to be further sanctions levied on all those who are directly or indirectly involved in these violations of human rights. The European Union cannot give in to blackmail. We need to provide humanitarian assistance to Syrian refugees, also in the countries surrounding Syria, but we don't want to see any forced returns. We don't want people sent back to their own countries involuntarily. They have to return voluntarily and in security. They need to be safe. The EU cannot support operations that are essentially social engineering. These are difficult times, and we need to highlight the courage of the Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who fought ISIS for us. There are major consequences that from all of this we need to show solidarity vis-à-vis these populations.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. What's happening today in northeast Syria is not just yet another episode in the tragedy which has been afflicting this part of the world for 8 years. This tragedy is ours. The Turkish assault, which targeted Kurdish troops fighting Daesh by our side, the militias supported by Ankara, savagely killed politicians, Evren Karlaf, for instance, who shared our values. There are camps where European terrorists were detained and that they are no longer surveyed or were not. And the policy which we set up has been flouted. The Atlantic Alliance, which is designed to be the very foundation of our security, was caught unawares and seemed to be paralyzed. But even more important, where is the European Union? We cannot be pleased that the role of Russia has been strengthened, and we cannot be pleased that the Americans considered us to be a negligible party. If we don't react here, history will take place without us and maybe even against us. We really need a strategy more than ever. We need a European defence which will enable us to protect ourselves and to ensure that our values are respected.
For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Urtasun.
Thank you, President. Well, we have seen the shameful abandoning of those who were in the front line of the fight against ISIS. This is shameful. 300,000 displaced people and 70,000 children, according to UNICEF, who are suffering under an illegal Turkish operation. We can expect Trump to tolerate this, but it's shameful that the European Union is doing nothing. We must condemn this military operation, but we should go further. We should call for an immediate withdrawal and for the UN mandate to be complied with. We need multilateral dialogue to be resumed in the region. The framework, Resolution 1325 of the UN needs to be respected, and we need a UN mission in the region. We also need to take on board our own responsibilities. We cannot tolerate Erdogan returning Syrian refugees to that area. This is something that we need to criticise. We have been blind for too long with regard to what's going on. What's going on with arms? We haven't taken a decision that goes further than new arms export licenses to Turkey. We also need to try to stop the export of arms that's going on under licenses that have already been awarded. In Syria, Europe has failed for pragmatic reasons and for other reasons too. We need to stop simply looking on, because this humanitarian crisis is also our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wilimski for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, Turkey is the subject for debate here. Once again, President Erdogan is the subject of discussion, not because of a lack of press freedom or human rights in Turkey, but this time because of an attack on Syria. The entire region is destabilized. There is once again a big loser, and that is the Kurds. The Kurds have never had sufficient support from the international society. They're one of the most disadvantaged peoples on this planet. They don't have their own countries. There are IS fighters in the region who are going to end up being able to free themselves and go to Europe. So we need to stop this support to Turkey. We need to enact a weapon embargo, and we need to consider sanctions. The situation as it is untenable, and let us not play the ostrich here. Thank you.
For 1 minute, Mr. Weimisch.
Thank you very much. The operation which Turkey has started in Syria illustrates the relationship between border controls and external affairs. Because of their absence of action, we have given our border controls to Turkey. We can't act, we can't do what we want, because Turkey has this ongoing threat to open the borders to migrants. So Erdogan is keeping Europe hostage. This invasion has undermined stability, it has caused injuries and death, it has damaged the coalition against IS. And we will never accept demographic changes in this area. But we can't do anything about it because we don't have control of our own borders. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Arvanitis.
Dear colleagues, the events show that there is a clear agreement between Trump and Putin. The main player is Mr. Erdogan. It looks like the advertisement of a whiskey company in the West. One comes, one goes. This meeting between Erdogan and Putin shows exactly the same thing. The West once again plays the role of the participative absence once again. The German government answered that up to the day of the embargo, up to yesterday in other words, 250 million euros of arms were sold to Turkey up until the first 8 months of 2018. It seems that many people earn something from this massacre, but there are some question marks. Who will guarantee the 1 million of Kurdish souls in the area? The Union? What are we going to say about the new wave of refugees to Europe? Will we send our condolences? Will we just have a new deal between Turkey and the EU? Or will we watch Erdogan closing the borders? The EU is untrustworthy in this.
For 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I find myself wondering what on earth Turkey thinks it's doing with its military aggression in northeast Syria. Haven't they an ounce of humanity? Don't they recognise the huge suffering that nation has already seen through civil war, through ISIS, through bombing? And yet here we stand debating Turkey, which is still on paper a candidate for EU accession. When Brexiteers pointed out the instability of the Erdogan regime, we were smeared by this chamber. We were accused of all kinds of awful things for pointing out that Erdogan's worldview is incompatible with modern democracy. Those who have turned a blind eye can do so no longer. And you should look in the mirror when you see what you have enabled. I'm going to sit back down now and resist the temptation to say, I told you so.
Mr. Milan Mon for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Well, this is a long and complex conflict in Syria, and the last thing we needed was more unilateral interventions and more crisis. There has been a loss of life, a lot of displacement as a result of the Turkish invasion, more advantages for ISIS as well. In addition, there is now a greater Russian presence in the area, which is becoming a kind of referee for the situation, as was shown yesterday by the agreement in Sochi. The American withdrawal and the absence of the EU created a vacuum which is occupied by Turkey, Russia and Iran. Russia is the crucial power here. The European Union needs to be more present externally. We can't simply limit ourselves to humanitarian assistance and contribute to reconstruction. We need to get involved and produce solutions, but we need a much more active security and defence policy. Global governance instruments such as the Security Council are not properly operational, and the US is falling back on itself. EU needs to be more active and more ambitious in security and defence policy, and Syria unfortunately shows us that once again. Thank you.
1 minute, Madam Insir.
Fru talman.
President, I'm embarrassed by the passivity the international and the community and the EU have shown so far in the battle for democracy and human rights and in the defence of international law in Rojava. I had hoped that in the draft joint resolution we would have seen measures such as no-fly zone in Rojava, and that the EU would take the initiative to protect the border between Turkey and Syria with a peacekeeping mission. The current proposal is good but insufficient. We must call what's happening by the right name. It is an invasion with the intention of occupation. It's not an intervention. I was in Iraqi Kurdistan in the weekend. There I met Mohammed, 12 years old, and one of the many children from Rojava who's been exposed to what is thought to be white phosphorus. Mohammed's only crime is to have been born a Kurd at the time when Erdogan, the dictator, is ruling Turkey. 100 years ago, Ismail Enver Pasha committed one of history's worst genocides against the Syrians, Greeks, Armenians and other Christians. Less than 50 years ago, northern Cyprus was invaded at the behest of Bülent Ecevit, and 2 weeks ago, Recep Tayyip Erdogan decided to invade Russia, but we shouldn't stand by in silence every time this happens. Thank you.
1 minute, Mr. Austrovicius.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissioner, colleagues. Using military force is not a right approach to solve strategic security challenges faced by Turkey within its southern border. On the contrary, it only adds the new ones. While fighting the Kurdish military forces, Turkey hurts Kurds, Syrians and its own citizens. In addition to civilian casualties, old wounds and anxieties of deeply traumatized population along the border is being reopened. The unfortunate US military withdrawal, unnecessary Turkish military invasion and destructive Russian military and political presence in Syria have created a new geostrategic shift, which can hardly be balanced or sustainable. The EU must play an active role in ensuring Turkish accountability and, at the same time, to do everything possible to pursue a critical dialogue with Turkey. Speaking of Syrian Kurds, we must seek for ways to relinquish their long-time suffering. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Alfonsi.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, the situation in Syria is really creating a very difficult situation. The Kurds fought hard and with courage against Daesh, and yet Turkey is adopting a very ambiguous position. Fighting the Kurds is like fighting a bastion, which is fighting terrorism. Then there's the question of women's rights. Kurdistan is proposing a new role model to the Muslim world, contrary to what exists in other Muslim countries. This is really essential for the world. And then there's the question of the security of Europe in an increasingly dangerous world where we need our allies. How will Europe find its allies of the future if it doesn't protect its allies of today? Europe can act strongly by taking the initiative and deciding on economic and diplomatic sanctions, which would be strong and come into force immediately. Trade relations between Turkey and Europe is very important, even more important than trade with the US. And therefore we must impose deterrence in the form of sanctions so that Mr. Erdogan reacts. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Madison, 1 minute.
Aitäh, austatud juhataja.
The Chair. I agree with all the people who have said here that it's unacceptable that the Turkish aggression to the northern Syria, but the sanctions are also questionable. Of course, I agree that we have to react, but the question is what countermeasures we can take. The left side of this hall says that economic sanctions would be viable. Okay, I agree. But at the same time, I have to say that Turkey has been blackmailing in the last years. The European Union is being said to that if we don't pay new sums of money to Turkey, they open up the borders. It's unacceptable. We have paid 6 billion euros in the last 4 years. Why? In order to be blackmailed again. Whether we like it or not, the United States have played a very important role keeping the stability in the region. When they pull out their troops, we have too much we play this game in the hands of the Russia and Turkey. I hope that the situation will be solved. Thank you.
Mr. Rowson, for 1 minute.
Microphone, please.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you very much, President. What has happened is unacceptable. Peaceful coexistence between Yazidis, Kurds and Christians under democratic self-determination has been destroyed through the Turkish invasion, which has the rather Orwellian name Peace Spring. our allies who fought for European security against ISIS are being left to their own devices. We have a new crisis, a new instability. Where is Europe, or rather, where was Europe earlier this year when the US asked for military support for the Syrian forces? The member states refused one by one. What's clear is that Turkey has crossed the line, and we need a strong reaction rather than the rather feeble reaction we've had. We need to stop looking at Turkey as a possible member of the EU. Are we going to give in to Erdogan's worldview?
Thank you, President. Just a week ago, after meeting with Turkish authorities, the European Commissioner for Migration stated that Turkey continues to be a key partner in managing migration and reaffirmed the agreement of shame between Turkey and the EU. And these statements were being made while the Turkish army was invading Rojava. It seemed that the European Union has decided to look the other way and actually go even further and legitimize Erdogan in his fight against the Kurdish people, because he is policing the borders of Fortress Europe. We would like to show our internationalist support with Rojava, and we condemn the attacks on the Kurdish people. The European Union cannot be an accomplice to this massacre. Funds to Turkey need to be frozen. We would like to see all pressure to put all possible pressure put on Turkey to end this war. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sonneborn, 1 minute.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Liebe Kollegen, wenn ich der
Colleagues, when I asked what I do for a living, I said I just come out of prison and I have to find out what to do next, because it's too embarrassing to say that I have anything to do with the EU in these times where we have the invasion of Rojava and civilians are being killed with German weapons, and we're just standing by. With the Turkish dictator, we need to speak a language that he understands. That's what we're told. And if Erdogan threatens 3 million refugees, then we can threaten with 3 million Turks from our countries. And if that doesn't work, another 3 million retirees, which should be a serious burden on the Turkish economy. Thank you.
Mr. Lenaers, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. A lot has been said about the conflict in Syria and the geopolitics. But it's not just a question of geopolitics. It's also a question about our security. Thousands of Europeans traveled to Syria to join IS. Many died, and many are still in the region. And many of these terrorists could exploit the chaos in order to find their way back. Now, over the past few years, we have better control on our external borders, on travellers. We've more exchange of passenger information in the EU. But we still have the feeling here of a very urgent situation, and Europol and the member states must double their efforts in this area, because security must be our absolute priority. And finally, our so-called ally in Turkey is saying that it's our problem. Yes, but at the same time, each and every country must deal with this issue. Together, we've got to deal with these terrorists. Thank you.
Mr. Glucksmann, 1 minute.
Madame la Présidente, chers collègues.
President, colleagues, yesterday's victorious smiles from Erdogan and Putin mirror our cowardice, and Syria really is shows the fact that we've abandoned people. We abandoned the Syrian revolutionaries to focus on the fight against ISIS, and then we abandoned our best allies in this fight against ISIS, the Kurdish forces. Today we're all going to blame Donald Trump, and we're right to do that. But what about us? What are we going to do? Sanctions? Yes, of course. Absolutely. But when? Night is falling in Syria, and we're only just waking up. We need to draw the appropriate lessons from our powerlessness, colleagues. NATO no longer makes sense, not because we no longer have adversaries, but we no longer have any reliable allies. Our mandate has to be to produce credible European defence policy. We need the European Union to move into adulthood. Victor Hugo said, "Those who live are those who fight with a firm objective in their hearts and minds. Our friends are dying, and we are not yet living."
For 1 minute, Mr. Gutta.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Voyons les choses.
Thank you, President. Well, let's say things the way they are. If a Syrian Kurdistan were to be created at the border of Anatolia, it might be seen by Ankara as an intolerable threat to the territorial integrity of Turkey. If this were not to be understood, the entry of Kurdish troops in Syria would be simply inexplicable. But this military adventure, can it really be accepted? No, it cannot be, Mr. Erdogan, because it simply compounds the pain and the suffering of the Kurds in Syria and in Turkey. What are you going to do, Mr. Erdogan? Stay in Syria and become an occupying force? Or leave and leave behind you a feeling of the need to have revenge? You are just compounding the rivalries in the zone and just fueling the tension. There is no wisdom and no reason of what you've done, Mr. Erdogan.
Ms. Rawat, for 1 minute.
Dear colleagues, a serious humanitarian crisis is rapidly developing in northeastern Syria. Erdogan will not tolerate the existence of a Kurdish democratic society in the region and seems set on a brutal offensive. Within the last 2 weeks, more than 176,000 people, including 80,000 children, have been displaced. We have heard from other speakers about the many reasons why we should protect these children and the Kurdish population who live there by right. Yet it is not only lives and homes that will be lost if Turkey's invasion is prolonged. Academics and political idealists the world over have admired Rojava's democratic society, where women are empowered and humans live in harmony with the earth. Let us remember that the EU itself was born as a collaborative political experiment to combat authoritarianism and militarism. It is our task to support our nearest and weakest neighbours in resisting those same threats. The world is watching. What is needed is not just words, but the kind of sanctions that work. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Choka.
Pazzesco, inaccettabile.
Crazy and unacceptable. Just think, in the last plenary, the Turkish authorities were giving out Turkish chocolates to ask the Europeans to resume negotiations with regard to Turkey joining the EU. But now it's not chocolates, it's missiles and bombs. As the Northern League has been saying, we should not be negotiating for Turkish accession. We shouldn't be sending any money to Turkey. We have a Europe who is funding this Turkish war, unbelievably, and that's completely unacceptable. In memory of Antonio Negalizzi, it's not enough to have a moment of silence. We can't simply name the room of a parliament after him, given that we are funding a war which is being fought against those who fought terrorism. So I hope that all those colleagues who received this box of Turkish chocolates are brave enough to send it back to the Turkish authorities with their hands covered in blood. The Speaker moves away from the microphone.
Please resume your seat. Please resume your seat. This is a house where we debate. We don't throw things around, and we are not violent. That is outrageous behaviour in a chamber. And sad to say, colleagues, that sort of thing is becoming far too common. This is a parliament where we debate. It is not necessary to roar and shout or throw items about. I hope you all agree with me in that ruling. I am appalled by what you just did, sir. Excuse me, you had the floor. Please listen. Please listen. Please. Would you please listen for a moment, sir? Because sometimes when you listen, you learn. It is my job to keep order in this House, and what you did was appallingly disorderly and disrespectful to the House. You can make your political points without being disorderly and abusive to other colleagues in this room. We will move on. For 1 minute, Mr. Slabakov. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. I have read the draft resolutions on Turkey. They're feeble and anemic. These resolutions betray weakness. They contain some accurate observations, but propose, unfortunately, only half-hearted measures that would achieve nothing. I would propose that we freeze all European investment where Turkish government institutions are involved. I am convinced this would have a sobering effect on Erdogan. It cannot be allowed for economic interests to always prevail over human values. I know that the measures I propose may lead to some economic losses, but they will be a small price to pay in order to save lives of thousands of innocent people. And if these measures prove to be insufficient, we should have a total embargo on Turkey, not sell them even a pin. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Morel.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. What good are our vain exhortations today? We say how strong is our admiration for the Kurds, but the sad truth is that we left them in their hour of their need. We, the Europeans, are standing by. We're doing nothing. Turkish aggression of 2 weeks ago was made possible by the fact that the Americans didn't follow up on their actions. We're now spectators, and we see Putin and Erdogan deciding on the fate of that region with Mr. Bashar Assad. This is a disaster for the Kurds, but for the Europeans it is a humiliating defeat on two fronts. So we've been unable to do anything about a unilateral and illegal invasion, and we've not been able to do anything to defend our allies. And we must draw the proper consequences when have a ridiculous NATO situation at the moment. We talk about NATO, but we're not doing anything because we're simply being told by the Americans who are taking ridiculous decisions. We've got to stop crying crocodile tears. We need to do something, and we need to take wise decisions if we're to be a Europe worthy of that name.
1 minute, Madam Ferreira.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Erdogan's government has gone beyond the limits of human decency in the Middle East. A massacre is taking place, a senseless act of dehumanization, a huge humanitarian crisis. The victims are the Kurdish community, and yet we should be grateful to them for their fight against IS. There are apparently thousands of displaced people, people who've escaped from prison. We've got civilians who are being killed, and the victims of bombing on the part of a country who's receiving EU funds, our trade and political partner. So words are no longer sufficient. We now have to move to action. Italy has announced stopping sales of arms to Turkey, and all European countries should do likewise. We should stop finance, stop the accession procedure, because the country is working against all the values on which the EU is based. Thank you.
Madam Zovko, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Ms. President and Commissioner. It is very difficult and emotional to talk about what Turkey is doing on both sides of its border. So many years after great massacres that happened in the Western Balkans, and after the news we received that there will not be any peace and stability in an area where Turkey has a very great influence. We can punish only civil society. Turkey doesn't need funds. Turkey needs a big moral warning that it is not good what it is doing. Erdogan has to also be put before an international criminal court. Everybody who displaced the population after it was done in Srebrenica and Vukovar and was done in Bihać have to be responsible before the International Criminal Court. There should be a new criminal court for the atrocities done there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Koster, for 1 minute.
The war that the Erdogan regime is running in northern Syria is against international law and destabilizes the entire region. By withdrawing their soldiers, the United States freed the Turks to invade. Erdogan's geopolitical strategy is to attack the Kurds and to increase the area of his own state. For years, the Kurds have been successfully fighting ISIS for the security of citizens in Europe as well. They lost 11,000 soldiers in the fight against ISIS. We owe them a great deal. I welcome the extension of the ceasefire, but the Kurds are paying a high price for it. Their interests are not being cared for. This is far from a peace settlement. Erdogan's plans need to be taken off the table, and the Kurds need to be given the conditions for an appropriate life. The European Union and the international community need to take their responsibilities on board.
1 minute, Mr. Tudoraka.
Doamnă președintă, mă alătur colegilor mei care au condamnat.
Thank you, President. As my colleagues have already said, I condemn the Turkish assault in Syria. The European Union must react from several viewpoints. First of all, from the point of view of the humanitarian crisis. This crisis had already reached historic order of magnitude. It's becoming even more serious now. In addition to the refugee crisis, we now have several hundred more refugees. And then we have the reappearance of the Islamic State, which is exploiting this situation, and certain prisoners have been released. And then finally, Erdogan must feel European diplomatic pressure, not just because he should not just control the refugee camps. He must also abide by the rule of law. Turkey, which only cooperates with Russia, must be given a clear message by the EU. There must be an arms embargo. We must also encourage Turkish society and support it, and support a process of stabilization of Syria. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Auken, for 1 minute.
President, in many of our countries, we have a lot of Kurds living. They've been living in our countries for many years. They're citizens. They're part of our countries. They're parts of our electorates. I think it's been brought very close to us and what is happening in Kurdistan at the moment, because like we do. They have close connections to their families back home. It's not that it's worse when something affects your own other than other people, but I think we really need to be made clear to us how much we are failing. I got a letter from Mothers from Peace.
Of peace, not of war and genocide, and we don't want our children to die anymore. Man plejer at sige, at
We say that the Kurds have only the mountains as for friends, but let us show them that they have other friends as well. And I hope the resolution that we adopt today will contribute to a change of course, so that we don't end up with the situation it looks like we're going to end up with.
For Mr. Riviere.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madame President. Well, I hear unanimous condemnation of the violent attack that Turkey has launched on Syrian territory. And obviously we need to condemn this war launched by Erdogan and the atrocities that go with us. But it's not enough just to have a few hours of debate. Let's deal with this at its roots. Turkey has been destabilizing the Middle East since the start of the Arab Spring, and part of the reason for that is because this hemicycle has bowed to the blackmail of Erdogan and accepted everything. You in the EPP have been saying that Turkey will never become a member of the EU, but that you continue to pay millions of European taxpayers' money to Turkey. You have paid him money to close the border that we have been unable to close. It's your cowardice, your double standards that have helped Erdogan to do what he's doing and have made Putin the master of the game. This needs to be stopped. We need to stop paying all these billions to Turkey.
For 1 minute, Mr. Procaccini.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Now, the tragedy of the Kurdish population in Syria has revealed a number of difficult situations. While the Kurds were fighting against Daesh and dying, Europeans were sitting on their couches watching the television. And now Europe is afraid of foreign fighters coming back to where they grew up. The second point is that when Turkey was gradually being transformed from a lay state to a Muslim state, the EU was providing funds with a view to its accession. Third point, the threat to set off the refugee bomb on the part of Turkey is something which cost us 6 million euros. So it's all very fine to apply sanctions to Erdogan and his allies, but we've got to stop Turkish accession to the EU.
Papadakis for 1 minute.
It's not a unilateral military action as the EU claims. It is an invasion in Syria of their strategic partner, Turkey, a member state of NATO. They want a share in the control of the region. Both the US-Turkey agreement and the US and the Russia-Turkey agreements are an imposition of imperialist peace under duress. They are a new round of horse trading and squabbling at the expense of the people. They create uncertainty within the military escalation in the region. So the so-called sanctions of the EU for the invasion in Syria and the violations in the Aegean and the Cypriot exclusion economic zone, while at the same time we see that there is more trade between the Turkey and the EU. We can have no friends in the EU, the US and NATO, as the New Democracy and Syriza government say in Greece. Every alliance with them is against the people. We should show solidarity with the Kurds and the Syrian people. We should stop the invasion. The Syrian people should decide on their future.
Mr. Kovachev, 1 minute.
Благодаря, госпожо председател.
Thank you.
the events in northeast Syria cause serious concern, and they are a sign of warning what happens when there is no strong foreign policy and capacity for action in the neighboring region on part of the EU. We are very good at making statements, but not so good at acting. Russia exploits the...
Sorry to interrupt you. Will we try again, please? No. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No problem.
Now it's okay, thank you.
Военната операция на Турция подкопава регионалната.
The military operation of Turkey undermines regional security and the fight against Daesh. All the apprehensions of our neighbors should be allayed through political and diplomatic means in cooperation with our NATO partners rather than through unilateral action. The temporary ceasefire did not put an end to the suffering of the population in the region. Whether we like it or not, Turkey is our partner, and it is in our interest to keep Turkey on the European track, provided it observes its commitments, and the countries neighboring Turkey need the solidarity of the EU, in particular Greece and Bulgaria. Thank you.
1 minute, Mr. Schieder.
Thank you very much, President. The military offensive on the part of Turkey is against international law, and it's also motivated by Turkish internal politics, because Erdogan's lost a lot of elections recently. It's led to mass flight of Armenians, Syrians, Syrians and other Christians. We've got 70,000 children fleeing at the moment. There is a danger that IS becomes strong again, and the YPG does not terrorists. They are indeed the people who freed us from IS terrorists. We need a proper ceasefire. We need a demilitarized zone, and we need sanctions and an embargo against Turkey. We should consider putting accession negotiations on ice. And first and foremost, we need solidarity with Kurdish self-administration in Rojava. Thank you.
1 minute, Mr. Benyon.
Thank you. The American withdrawal may be one of the greatest betrayals of modern times. A year ago, Donald Trump said of the Kurdish militias, "They fought with us, they died with us, they are great people, we do not forget that, I do not forget that." The Kurds, unfortunately, now stand as the useful idiots of the Americans. The American withdrawal is not only a betrayal, it is in geopolitical terms highly irresponsible. Now, the vacuum may have left Turkey with what it sees as a difficult decision to make, but Turkey would do better to look to its own territory and give more political space to opposition parties supported by the Kurds and to journalists supporting their rights if it is to successfully address terrorist threats. We now urgently need a political solution that allows rapid return of displaced persons, but also minimises the strategic ground conceded to Russia, Assad and Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Ciccardi.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Only 100 years ago, the Armenians were massacred without any pity. Now, the same murderers are attacking the Kurdish people. In Istanbul, the empire still rules. And who cares if this means that the blood of innocent people should flow? So many people have been killed, including many defenders of human rights. After the Turkish invasion in Syria, the warriors are sharpening their weapons before our gates. There were terrorists in Kurdish prisons which are escaping. And there's a threat now to invade Europe after having received 6 billion euros from Europe. This is not acceptable. The US and Russia are acting as the main world players, and Europe is there looking on. It is silent and it isn't moving. With the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini, she is silent on this, and as an Italian, I'm ashamed of this. And it's now time to move. We must not be accomplices. No to Turkey in Europe, now and forever.
Mr. Gürking.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you. Well, I think it is terrible to see how people are using this parliament, misusing this parliament. What Mr. Sonnenborn said is not on. The Kurdish people have been betrayed. They have been left alone by us and the Americans. Everyone knew that the Turks would move in as soon as American troops were withdrawn. The suffering of people in Syria, men, women and children, seems endless. The conflict needs to be ended. We have been awarded a Nobel Peace Prize and we have values, and that should oblige us to act. We should stand up and say, no, Mr. Erdogan, this incursion is not going to produce peace, this is murder and this is against international law. We need to be clear on all of this. There are states that abuse press freedom, the freedom of people and human rights. And there is no place for them in our European house for these kinds of states. Diplomacy is always essential. We need to freeze funds being paid to Turkey. The speaker's interrupted. It is important that Europe speaks here with a strong voice. The speaker's cut off.
Mr. Giangoshi, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Many references here were made to the lack of unity in the European Union and the failure to even release a common resolution, a declaration condemning Turkish aggression. Firstly, as it was Hungary that vetoed this common declaration, as a Hungarian, I think I must apologize and make it extremely clear that when Viktor Orban speaks on behalf of Hungarians, then it must be rejected. I can assure you that it is not in the interest of Hungarians or in the interest of Hungary to support any aggression, may it be anywhere. No, it is not in the interest of Hungarians, and as far as the Turkish military action is concerned, we must understand Turkish security concerns, but we also have to make clear that there is no military solution to this problem, only political and diplomatic. This aggression only further destabilizes Syria, diverts attention from fighting terrorism and exacerbates the migration crisis. There were questions asked about where the European Union is. We have been standing by and watching as our neighbourhood was destabilized in North Africa and in the Middle East. We must place Europe back on the map and make it more visible before other dominant powers take over control.
Thank you. Michel Bellamé, 1 minute, please.
Merci, Madame. Chers collègues, l'indignation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we share the indignation, but being indignant is not enough. What's at stake is peace in the Middle East and our own security as well, because Mr. Erdogan is the best ally of ISIS at the moment, and his attack is going to have consequences for Europe, but we're unable to do anything. This silence is made up of the impotence of Europe in this situation, because we've constructed a market rather than sharing values which arise from our history, and because of that we can't freely decide on our migrant policy. So therefore Mr. Erdogan can threaten us in terms of migration policy, because we can't master our external borders and we can't face up to the needs of the world. If we never again want to be spectators of what's going on. We've got to do everything now. We have to suspend the funds paid to Turkey, which is this country has nothing to do in an accession program. Thank you.
Mr. Papadakis.
Thank you, Chair. Turkey proceeds with an ethnic cleansing of the Kurdish element in the area, using the space that the US left behind by withdrawing from the area. Everybody is present there in this region except for the European Union, and apart from the victims of the Turkish atrocities, it is the European Union that will have to pay the bill without being able to take any initiative in order to stop this invasion. Of course, the economic transactions of European countries are more important than the protection of the Kurdish people who fought against Daesh. We cannot stand watching the European Union being blackmailed by Erdogan.
For 1 minute, Madam Rees.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. The Kurdish, Arab, Christian and Turkmeni fighters have fought for mankind, but where is our humanity gone? This is a quote from a Belgian citizen who is also a Kurd, and he addresses us today. And we are Kurds in the face of this illegal assault. The American president taking the wrong decisions, and there's this ongoing bombing of all these men and women who fought for us, for their freedom, for our freedom. And it is ironic that now we have the enemies of democracy. Assad today is virtually legitimate, which is really incredible. And where is Europe in all of this? The arms embargo rejected by our ministers. This is simply impossible to understand. And then we are indignant faced with the funds being paid to Turkey. We need to recover our dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kofod for 1 minute.
I'm extremely worried. Erdogan is threatening Europe that he'll send millions of migrants towards the European continent. The EU system has failed, and it's given the control of the external borders to Erdogan. That is a fact. At the same time, the EU system is flooding EU taxpayers' monies into Erdogan's coffers, and we've totally failed to protect the external borders, which resemble a sieve. We're now being threatened with the same chaos as we had in 2015, when Europe was silted up by migrants, and we'll soon find a situation where terrorists go to Europe for Christmas, so that European citizens have to flee for their lives at Christmas markets. We've refused recently to slam the lid of the money box for Erdogan. This is ridiculous, and it is to a very great extent the responsibility of this Parliament.
Excuse me, for 1 minute, Madam Juris Nicholsonova.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne. Chcem povedať, že som bývala veľmi hrdá na projekt.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, I used to be proud of the European Union project, but now I'm ashamed. We have thrown the Kurds overboard in Syria. We're criticizing Trump for his withdrawing of American troops in Syria, but actually the Middle East is far closer to Europe than the United States. Where are our military units? Our foreign security and defense policy is weak. We just look on while things take place. The West is now out of the game, and the only people involved now talk to Putin rather than us. We let Putin get involved and do what he wants. And the Visegrad 4 countries have previously stated that problems need to be resolved at their roots. What are we waiting for here? We should be ashamed. The EU should be ashamed.
A minute, please.
The UK has finally suspended arms exports to Turkey. Too little, too late. We now want economic sanctions, but our intentions are futile when the EU continues to pay this rogue state to further commercial and expansionist ambitions. The Kurds, in their tens of thousands, stood shoulder to shoulder with Europe to protect us from brutal terrorists. Thousands laid down their lives. They should be rewarded. Instead, the EU does nothing, while Erdogan uses EU bribes to fund his war and commits human rights atrocities, from the murder of civilians to chemical weapons. What price? The life of a Kurd. Based on the €1,500 a day the EU gives to Turkey and the 160,000 Kurdish people now displaced, apparently 1 cent. This is not only a tragedy, but a major historical betrayal, and I implore this morally bankrupt political bloc to change course. It's funny, everybody in this chamber is in agreement on this, so the executive must take heed or they prove this parliament is pointless.
Mr. Rangel, for 1 minute.
Muito obrigado, Sra. Presidente. Queria, em primeiro lugar, dizer...
Thank you very much, President. I have to say that I've been listening to what's been said in this chamber, condemning just about everything. All condemning the incursion of Turkey into Syria, which has led to hundreds of thousands of refugees and indeed has also caused a number of victims. Not only is it a violation of international law, it's also a violation of humanity. We have to say that the European Union, and more to the point, the European Council needs to take more stringent measures against the incursion of Erdogan. I'm extremely concerned because it reminds me of some historical precedents from a dark time, this pact between Erdogan and Putin. We can't leave the fate of Syria in the hands of two autocrats, Putin and Erdogan. We've seen that in history before, and we've seen how disastrous that was for humanity.
Thank you, President. We are all experiencing anger at this situation, faced with this situation, this assault on the part of Turkey. This is a war crime. It's a crime against humanity. The Kurdish people have been betrayed. The international community just turned around and didn't look. With the relationship with Mr. Putin, here we have yet another step taken against humanity. Just an arms embargo isn't enough. We really have to block this truly criminal folly. Pablo Neruda used to say that hope has two children, indignation and courage. Indignation because of the reality of things and the courage to change them. The motion which we'll be voting on tomorrow is undoubtedly an important step in the right direction. But then we have to move on to action. A no-fly zone is urgent. Some sort of army which would protect the Kurdish people with humanitarian corridors and economic sanctions. When should we move, if not now?
Turkey's offensive against Kurds in northern Syria has devastated medical facilities, civilians, and deprived thousands of people of access to clean water. This is helping ISIS to revive and further destabilise the region. Some member states promptly banned arms sales to Turkey. Liberal Democrat MEPs wrote to the UK Prime Minister to demand we also stop enabling genocide. The UK has now promised to issue no new export licences, but will not review licences already granted. This is a moral halfway house that is not acceptable, and Donald Trump's appalling actions in this matter underline the need for a strong, effective Europe. If we give arms to those who commit crimes, we are responsible as those who pull the trigger. There has been no real prospect of Turkey joining the EU for many years. The time has come to formally end Turkey's status as an EU candidate country.
Madam Lizzi, for 1 minute.
Non sono solo I curdi.
It's not only to the Kurds that we should be showing solidarity. This Turkish offensive risks destroying the Christian community that's been present in Syria for 2,000 years. They're an essential part of the social fabric. The EU has an obligation to defend Christianity, both inside and outside the Schengen area. Europe needs to be proactive in defending peace in the Middle East and guaranteeing human rights without bowing down to arrogance, blackmail and the explicit threat to send 3.6 million migrants in our direction. Sanctions are all very well, but we mustn't forget that it's the European Union which has been funding Ankara for years via various channels, such as the Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance and funding from the European Investment Bank, or the contributions which are sent in the form of assistance for refugees to Turkey. Now it's clearer than it has ever been that Turkey's EU accession process must be stopped. Were they to join, it would lead to the Islamization of our continent and would reduce Christians to a small persecuted minority, as is the case today in Syria.
Your time is up. Thank you very much, and your microphone is switched off, so nobody can hear you. We move now to our next speaker for 1 minute, Mr. Christoforo.
Thank you, Chair. Turkey's invasion in Syria is an atrocious crime against the European Union, against Europe, against humanity. I believe that it is about time that we should stop speaking. We should start acting. Zero tolerance for Turkey. It doesn't just attack the Kurds. It attacks humanity as a whole, because the Kurds was the shield that helped us stop ISIS, so that we can sleep in peace. With our acceptance of what Erdogan does now, we are co-responsible for what is happening. Turkey, in 1915, wiped out the Armenians. In 1920, the Greeks of Pontus. In 1974, it attacked Cyprus. Last year it was on Anthrep. This year it is the ethnic cleansing of the Kurds. I'm a proud European, but I'm ashamed when the Turks use European weapons against the Kurds, and we still haven't taken decisive action to stop this invasion.
Madam Fajon, 1 minute, please.
Hvala, predsedujoča. Na severu Sirije je premirje.
Thank you very much. In the north of Syria, we have a rather feeble ceasefire which can be misused by Erdogan because of his threats and the lack of unity in the EU. The attack by Turkey is a crime against international law, and the EU needs to stand together to come up with an arms embargo against Turkey and economic sanctions, because that would be a way of influence Ankara. We forget that the Kurdish issue is not going to be solved. The link with Assad is not going to take account of their aspirations. In the southeast of Turkey, Turkey has often carried out military operations against the Kurds. It's going to continue to be a time bomb, and it's going to lead to more refugees, more people killed, more people injured. Where is our humanity? We should be ashamed of ourselves.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, I've listened to this long debate very carefully. We've heard frustration, But I don't think anyone has felt fear, really, because fear is what you feel when you're living under bombardments. We knew what was going to happen. We knew that Turkey was going to invade, and we also knew that dangerous jihadi fighters would escape from custody. We knew that ISIS could re-emerge. We all knew this because we'd been warned. We Europeans wasted an opportunity to set up an international tribunal so that we could deal with the situation. We have wasted the opportunity to bring back European children in the jihadi fighters' camps. The truth is that we're an economic giant, but we're not a player in geopolitical issues. We are still trying to deal with a migration crisis that's been going on for an awfully long time. How can we act on this latest issue? We need to do away with the contradictions that we're in. We need a proper security and defence policy. Without that, we can't look to the future. Thank you.
Sandrov Yordanov.
Thank you. The situation changed yesterday. Putin and Erdogan got what they wanted. Bashar Assad agrees, although he is a main culprit for the situation. The policy of Turkey is not simply anti-Kurdish, it is anti-European. It goes against our positions. You should be deeply concerned by the process between Russia and Turkey. This is not mere diplomatic flirtation. It is a more dangerous process. We can offer the solution. We can offer the vision on how to resolve the problem, including the Kurdish question. But it does not mean support for leftist, nationalist parties of the Kurds operating within the Turkish territory. Thank you.
For 1 minute, Mr. Heinaloma.
Arvoisa puhemies.
President, the Turkish offensive is against international law and you cannot accept it. The European Union, unfortunately, has remained in the sidelines, just watching on when Turkey, US, Russia, Syria, even Iran is organizing things in the area. Syrian oil has more protectors and more rights now than the refugees or the Kurds for whom we owe so much. The European Parliament should send a very clear message. We expect the Council, the High Representative and the Commission more decisive action so that this tragedy can be ended and Turkey understands the limits of its operations. This means definitive action and European Union common policy also on an arms embargo.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Grundler.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. This new war in North Syria, the initiative of Turkey, is a violation of international law. It's an inhumane decision displacing 300,000 people, 60,000 children, and 120 civilians have already been killed. This isn't a fight against terrorists. It's a fight against a people, including the Kurdish people. The vast majority of Kurds only want one thing: to live in peace and to be free. We are far more powerful if we turn towards each other as opposed to turning against each other. And Mr. Erdogan should think very carefully about that sentence. This 30-kilometer safe zone, which he's imposing with military means, is not going to lead to a long-lasting solution. How many how many people will really want to go and live there on a voluntary basis? International law does not allow people to be sent, refugees to be sent to the other side of the border. So several years down the road, the suffering of the Kurdish people, unfortunately, is far from over.
Thank you, Chair. It should now be beyond any doubt to everyone that Erdogan's Turkey does not belong in this European Union. And by invading Syria and using his war on terror as a pretext to displace and slaughter civilians, Erdogan has made it perfectly clear that the international rule-based order is not to his liking, just like he is illustrating by occupying Cyprus, drilling off its coastline and repeatedly violating Greek airspace and territorial waters. And by persecuting and harassing political opponents and Kurdish and Christian citizens at a massive scale, Erdogan has also made it perfectly clear that he detests everything that this European Union stands for. Erdogan detests our European way of life. He detests our democracy, our fundamental freedom, our human rights, our liberty, and our rule of law. There cannot be a place for Erdogan's Turkey in the EU. And now is the time for this European Union to terminate accession talks with Turkey. Thank you.
Mr. Arakovac, for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dear colleagues, most of us have probably read the book entitled The 40 Days of the Musadah, written in the last century. The horrible genocide described in this book seems to happen again, and we cannot remain silent. It is unacceptable at the same time that a government in the Union, and I'm talking about the Hungarian government, support an autocratic regime that has declared war on the Kurds in Syria and that destabilizes the region and causes humanitarian crisis. Let's make this clear. Viktor Orban, who qualifies refugees as enemies and threatens us with them, has started to support an aggression that made hundreds of thousands of people leave their homes. At the same time, the way the foreign policy of the European Union currently works is not tenable. We cannot let unscrupulous politicians who have no moral principles stop the European Union act jointly when it comes to foreign and security policy. Therefore, I call on the Council to make decisions at long last, with qualified majority instead of unanimity. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Groschel.
Turški vdor v Sirijo je nov krog pekla v tej tragediji 21. stoletja.
Thank you, President. Well, this invasion of Syria is a new circle of hell in this 21st century tragedy. We're seeing violations of human rights, violations of international law. This is a NATO member state which is using its army and also militias and paramilitary forces. Turkey is looking to its own security interests, but let's not be naive here. The meeting in Sochi showed us what this is really about. This relates to geopolitical interests and a post-war Syrian order. This is not about fighting terrorism, because the Kurds were the only force that fought, well, they did the lion's share of the fighting against the ISIS terrorists. This is abuse of millions by Erdogan, and their misery is being used for political blackmail. We need to react together as the European Union. We have the means to act, but do we have the will?
1 minute, Mr. Mandel.
Thank you very much, President. It said that the first victim in any war is truth, and the title of this Turkish operation is the first casualty truth is the first casualty. They say that this is an exercise in peace. It isn't. Turkey is ignoring European values. We must stop considering a Turkey candidate for EU. It's not acceptable that a minority stops Albania and North Macedonia, who've done a lot for our values, from being candidates, but Turkey continues to be a candidate. We should suspend the customs union and thus weaken the already weak economy in Turkey. We know half of the Turkish population does not back the current government. We think we should send a clear signal on behalf of European citizens.
Thank you. Mr. Androulakis, 1 minute.
A year and a half ago, we were discussing about the Turkish invasion in Afrin again. The only thing that changed was the name. Now we have the peace spring and not the olive branch. Now, with the tolerance of the international community and the bigger geopolitical players of the area, Turkey hits upon the Kurds, who actually stood against ISIS. We have a source of blood and a human crisis, not a spring of peace, as Mr. Erdogan baptized this operation. Ironically, we stop there watching, but we need immediate sanctions. The arms embargo will stop the deliveries of arms from all countries. It's not only about new orders, and we have to give sanctions to all those who have a responsibility for the invasion, and new sanctions that will prove that Europe means what it says.
Mr. van Dalen, 1 minute.
President, with the withdrawal of the American troops from North Syria, President Trump has left the Kurds and the Christians in the lurch, totally in the lurch. The so-called deal which the American leader, in his wisdom, the deal which he clinched with Erdogan, is not working. Unfortunately, the Council of Ministers for Foreign Affairs has adopted a shameful position regarding the arms embargo. Here and there, Turkish ambassadors are being called to explain the situation, but this is really nothing for the Kurds and the Christians in the region. The time has come for Europe to adopt a very firm position. The economic and the trade relations with Turkey should come to an entire halt, not simply suspended. The Kurds and the Christians must be supported wherever possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Barley, 1 minute.
Eins muss uns, glaube ich, allen.
I think one thing must be clear to all of us. There's not going to be a military solution for this region. The only possible solution is political, and that will only happen if we involve the UN, which hasn't been mentioned at all this morning. We've got the invasion of Syria with the support of Russia, and we see the best ally of ours being left to their own devices. We've seen Erdogan and Putin dividing Syria between themselves. We're not a big player in this region. We don't have the competence. We've missed the bus on this. And there's no competence being transferred. Our biggest weapon is economic sanctions and a stop to arms supplies. This must be the reaction from Europe if we're to mean anything when we talk about international law.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Zoido Alvarez.
Thank you, Madam President. Today's debate has clearly shown that the serious facts that are taking place in northern Syria are having dramatic effects, economic, social and political effects. But I want to focus on the fact that thousands of ISIS terrorists with European passports will be able to escape custody. They will be able to return to the European Union, and they will be a security risk. There are thousands of terrorists who want to come to Europe, and we can't allow them to do that. In Spain, we suffered from ETA terrorism over decades. There were thousands of victims, but they were defeated by the work of the security and police forces, by the rule of law and by the support of Spanish civil society. Basing ourselves on our experience, we believe that to fight terrorism, the EU needs a more ambitious security and defence policy, which will prevent these ISIS terrorists from carrying out terrorist acts. Thank you.
Mr. Lopez, for 1 minute, please.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. Well, today we are sending out a firm and clear message. We fully reject Turkey's military invasion in the northeast of Syria. Their decision shows contempt for international law, the UN and NATO. It has terrible humanitarian consequences and destabilizes the region. It causes more displacements, and this is being done with the complicity of the United States, and the victims are the Kurds, our allies, who were heavily involved in fighting and defeating ISIS. Europe needs to reject this intervention and also respond in a firm manner. We need to use the tools we have. We need to ban the sale of weapons to Turkey, and we need to use our market, which Turkey benefits from. We need to stop the Turkish accession process, which is completely nonsensical now.
Mr. Bilcik, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. It's been said already, but we need to repeat it. Turkish invasion into northeastern Syria threatens the stability of the whole region. It strengthens those who want to ignite a much larger conflict in the Middle East. It is therefore in our vital interest of the EU and our member states to fight for territorial integrity of Syria. We cannot allow the redrawing of borders in a forceful way. We cannot allow the precedents from the annexation of Crimea to be repeated in Syria today. This is extremely important, and we have to resist it. Therefore, dear colleagues, arms embargo, financial sanctions, and suspension of EU accession talks with Turkey is the least we can do immediately, and we should do it now. More broadly, we do need to fight for European values in our neighbourhood. We cannot allow the increasing Turkish and Russian presence in our vicinity. This is our vital European strategic interest.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Majorino.
Erdogan has committed an assault, an act of war. This is the first thing that we should say in the European Parliament, and this is why the response must be very harsh indeed. Europe up to now has had difficulty in speaking out in a single, united, clear and strong voice. We don't need just generic condemnations. We need to speak out very clearly. The military intervention of Turkey is something for which they must answer for. We have the arms embargo, trade sanctions which can be taken, measures which can be taken to not leave the victims on their own. The women and children of the Kurdish people, such as Hevran Kalaf, we need to intervene on the spot. The Kurdish people must be aware of our solidarity. We must show our solidarity. We use that solidarity to fight against ISIS, and now we've simply shamefully forgotten about them. And Erdogan is using the refugees in his relations with Europe. For them too, the conflict must cease immediately, and the Turkish army must withdraw immediately.
1 minute, Mr. Kefalogiannis.
Thank you, Chair. Under the pretext of the Kurds living in Syria are all, one and all, terrorists, Turkey invaded, and they continue their operations, and the victims are civilians and children. The same country, in 1974, using a similar pretext, invaded the Republic of Cyprus, and since then it occupies 40% of the territory of the island. We all agree with the European Council decision, which condemns clearly this invasion, causing thousands of victims, and endangers our fight against ISIS, and is a serious threat against European security. We condemn this attack without asterisks and notes. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Marcus, for 1 minute, please.
Obrigada, Presidente. Em 2016, a União Europeia...
Thank you. In 2016, the European Union did something to support 3 points. 0.7% of the population of 28% were refugees living in Turkey. We have to remember one point, and that is the borders. And we need to look at some of the agreements that were blocked by member states. Some member states of the European Union would not help the ones that took most of the refugees, and that's why this mechanism had to be triggered. And since that day, Turkey has constantly been blackmailing the EU with the opening of the borders, and that's happening again. Turkey, of course, had security concerns, but marching in to Syria is something that we must condemn. There's no military solution. The EU must stand united and must use its influence with the United Nations to work for peace in the region. Thank you.
1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's not often that Parliament is united on one point, but this morning we are criticizing what Turkey is doing in northeast Syria, and we understand the reason for that. Donald Trump withdrew troops suddenly. That was to ensure that his image would be kept, and we've seen the results. We see suffering, and this has been happening for generations. 200,000 people without homes, and ISIS coming back. We have to do our best. We have to prevent the exportation of weapons to Turkey. We need to look at the financial aid that we're giving, and we need to find a political solution under the auspices of the UN. Thank you.
1 minute, Mr. Peters.
President, it's a good thing that we can send a clear message to Turkey from the European Union. Our draft resolution makes this very clear. Turkey has to be aware that our support for accession is, or our support is not without conditions. Turkey is supposed to be working towards European standards. We can't continue to pay this support. This crisis in Syria is a clear wake-up call for Europe, a wake-up call for a proper European defense strategy, for a proper migration policy, and for the EU to stand for a proper peace solution in northern Syria, which is currently being managed by the army of another country. This is the only way we can stop people fleeing, stabilize the country, and stop people being injured and killed. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Furlas.
Thank you, Chair. We look the other way when a crime was committed. We let those who fought against ISIS at the hands of Turkey. And now we're discussing what measures and when we should introduce. 45 years ago, Turkey called the invasion of my country a peace intervention. 45 years later, there are still 200,000 refugees and people missing. And like we do now, then 45 years ago, Turkey was left to continue its invasion. And that's what we're doing. Look the other way. It's a similar situation to Cyprus in 1974. The crime was committed and nobody was punished. We have terrible responsibilities and Europe is absent. History will judge us. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Bentler, for 1 minute.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin, wir sprechen heute.
Madam Chair, we're talking about the operation of Turkey in northern Syria. The situation up till now and in the past has been that Syria, when we're dealing with European interests, the United States, Russia and Assad seem to take the lead on this. And Europe is simply there for humanitarian aid. So the conclusion that we can draw, and this comes back to what we have been claiming for in the EPP, we really need to set up a structure, a European Security Council and a defense ministry. We need to equip ourselves with the military necessities. So the as was suggested by the German Minister of Defense, we need to have an international protection area and we need to be able to come to European decisions on this. And this unacceptable situation by the Turks needs to be stopped, and ethnic cleansings shouldn't just be criticized, but we should be very active in trying to take part in this situation. Let us now finally move ahead and let us take a decisive step to a political union. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. We come now to Catch the Eye, and there are over 16 people looking for a request to speak. I will not be able to take everyone, so we begin immediately with Madam Vosenberg for 1 minute.
Ευχαριστώ, κυρία Πρόεδρε. Η Τουρκία για μια ακόμη φορά υλοποιεί τα παράνομα σχέδιά της περιφρονώντας το διεθνές δίκαιο.
Thank you very much. There is a situation in which Turkey has just marched into northern Syria and has actually created hundreds of thousands of refugees, and it is a violation of human rights. And now there are losses of life, but the European Union is just watching on, and I believe we do have a responsibility here. The Turkish policy, the change of the situation, simply does not comply with international rules. We need to try and work towards the implementation of sanctions, and money should flow into civil society. Turkey is responsible, therefore it can't possibly be part of the European family.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm reading the title, the Turkish military operation in northeast Syria and its consequences. I think it could have been much better. It could read like this. This is not just a military operation, and it is a military invasion, and its consequences are not just matters of security or betrayal of our Kurdish allies against the scourge of the Islamic State. Its consequences of this military Turkish invasion are specific crimes against humanity, including ethnic cleansing and the plans for illegal settlements against Syria. Just like with the continuing Turkish occupation of the northern part of the Republic of Cyprus, just like Afrin, but we can. We can impose arms embargo, we can crush Erdogan's economy, and yes, we can bring the criminal to justice. It's about time.
Thank you. Madam Bilbao Barandica. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like here to express our total rejection of the illegal attack by Turkey. It's a violation of international law. It's causing civilian casualties and mass displacements of people. Turkey wants to move 2 million refugees into an area where Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen and Assyrians were living together peacefully. It's reopening conflicts that will imply a role for major world powers. NATO must work on Turkey, and the EU and the international community must work for a diplomatic solution. That accompanied by humanitarian action, making a priority of bringing back to Europe the minor children of ISIS fighters.
Madam Kempa, 1 minute, please.
Bardzo dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca. Szanowni Państwo, mamy dyplomację europejską.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you. We have the existing instruments. We have means to address this. And what happens? Russia gets ahead of us. They have the advantage, and that's really regrettable. Europe suffers from the following conflict in the results of the conflicts in the Middle East. So that's why we should be taking efforts to end these conflicts, not just at a verbal level, but we should take action in order to end this conflict. We have to think about the victims, and I would like to thank Commissioner Stylianides, who is doing quite a lot of work for the victims of this situation. But in the Middle East, in Syria, there are missionaries and other volunteers who are aiding the victims despite their own personal danger. So we have to support these people.
Our next speaker is Mr. Papadimoulis.
Ευχαριστώ, κυρία Πρόεδρε. Λόγια, λόγια, λόγια.
Words, words and more words. Erdogan invades Syria with the authorization of Trump, basically, with the support of Putin. Agreements are signed, not respecting international legitimacy. We revise the Lausanne Agreement, and basically the European Union is simply a political non-entity. We need to look at sanctions, strong sanctions, arms embargoes, a unanimous decision taken by the Security Council, which has existed for months now. And this was signed, and it is actually high time to apply these texts to make sure that we need to make sure that France and Germany don't just look at their own economic interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Colleagues, the Turkish invasion to Syria needs to be condemned. It was against the Kurds who fought against the Islamic State and whose fighters now are free as a result of the Turkish intervention. The intervention has caused instability, caused another wave of refugees, but most of all, it's caused losses of human lives and suffering of innocent people. It's good that Turkey has now suspended the offensive, also under pressure of the United States and of the European Union. A safety zone in the north of Syria would make sense, but only under the auspices of international forces, not as a territory occupied by the Turkish forces. And the Turkish invasion must not be regarded as a unique single act, but Turkey has been acting in recent years as a country that does not share European values. Thank you.
1 minute, Ms. Ward.
Millions of people from diverse ethnic and religious communities in this region are under threat. Tens of thousands have been displaced. Besides Kurdish and Arabic villages, Christian neighbourhoods have been targeted. It's obvious these attacks are carried out by Turkish military with the aim of ethnic cleansing and demographic change. As a member of Women Defend Rojava, an international campaign against fascism and patriarchy, I raise my voice here to call for an immediate end to Turkey's invasion and occupation in North and East Syria, the establishment of a no-fly zone, an end to the weapons trade with Turkey, political and economic sanctions against Turkey, the recognition of war crimes already committed by Turkey, and the prevention of further war crimes and ethnic cleansing by Turkish forces, ISIS, al-Nusra and other jihadist terrorist groups. The acknowledgement of the democratic, autonomous administration of the people of North and East Syria, and a political solution with representation and participation of women and people from all the different national, cultural and religious communities in Syria.
Madam, please, please, Ms. Ward. Everyone needs to get their opportunity. Our next speaker for 1 minute is Madam Joveva.
Thank you very much, Chair. I support this resolution and the proposed calls upon Turkey. I agree with the call towards the European Commission when it comes to freezing funds for Turkey. These funds should not be used to finance military operations, but these calls will not be enough. We should not allow Erdogan to blackmail us. We should not allow that security questions of the region, which is in our close vicinity, are being settled exclusively by third countries. We should not allow killings, forceful deportations and further humanitarian catastrophes. We need to freeze all the funding, and we need an all-European embargo on the sales of weapons, but in addition to that we need to set up a no-fly zone and a UN-led security zone. It's true, Moscow and Ankara have reached an agreement, and Turkey does not seem to wish to continue the offensive, but what does this mean? The people living there will continue living in fear, and this is the least of the problems. We need to have a common European foreign and security policy and be a political player in this field.
1 minute.
Thank you. Military intervention in Syria is no short-term thing. This is something that's been going on for 8 years, and there are people responsible for this. The US and the major EU powers who, together with other NATO members such as Turkey and other allies such as Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE and Qatar, helped organize an armed groups who were responsible for the murders of thousands of people and the forced dislocation of millions of others, disrupting the socio-economic and cultural fabric of the country. The responsibility of the institutions and the member states who are trying to take a distance from this new military aggression against Syria is totally hypocritical. It's not enough vis-à-vis Turkey. We have to bring an end to this external aggression against the Arab Republic of Syria and defend its sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity in respect of international law and the principles of the UN Charter. Thank you.
Madam Kenichi.
Thank you, Madam. In this debate, I'd like to remind you that the first victims of this Turkish offensive in northern Syria are children. And it is precisely the 2008 agreement of the European Union on victims of armed conflict. It is children that suffer most. And this is certainly also true for Syria. I think that there are at least 70,000 children who are in the northern part of Syria, and if these hostilities continue, there will be some more thousands of children which will also need humanitarian aid. If you look at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Children, the Rights of Minors, and we'll be celebrating the 30th anniversary of this quite soon, European Union needs to take diplomatic steps in order to put an end to this conflict, to make sure that anyone who has influence to put into the area, we need to protect the children in this type of conflicts. Children are children in every situation. We have a duty to protect them.
Mr. Wallace, 1 minute.
Thanks, Madam President. Turkey has crossed the border and entered the sovereign country of Syria. It's a violation of international law. Turkey has invaded Syria, not Kurdistan. We must express solidarity with the Kurdish people, but the territorial integrity of Syria is a matter for the Syrians to decide. About 8% of the Kurds live in Syria. 50% of them live in Turkey, where they are treated abysmally, making Turkey an apartheid state in their behaviour. When the PKK fighters cross the border into Syria, they're called rebel fighters. When they come back into Turkey, they're called terrorists. And what is Europe doing about it? Sadly, when European countries, Europe paid Turkey $6 billion in the last 2 years to cage migrants whose homes were destroyed with the help of European countries. When is Europe going to stop behaving like this?
Our last speaker, Madam Grappini, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Commissioner. You now have the opportunity to witness unanimity here. And yes, we've heard that both the Council as well as the Commission criticize this attack, this invasion by Turkey and Syria. We are doing the same, but is it enough? Is this criticism enough? We have a resolution that we will vote tomorrow, but is this enough? I believe that EU, together with other international institutions, has an obligation to intervene through concrete measures. What can we do? Of course, Turkey is important. It's important as a market, but what do we choose? To develop the economy of the internal market or the security of citizens? People are dying there, women and children. These are people that we need to protect, because one of our objectives is to ensure peace and security. And as Mr. Juncker was saying yesterday, we have peace in the European Union, but is this enough? We have an international responsibility, and we need to do more than just draft a resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Madam Tuppurainen on behalf of the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Madam.
Of views was very useful and timely. I would like to take this opportunity to thank honourable members for their interventions, comments and suggestions. Turkey's unilateral military action in north-east Syria has and is causing unacceptable human suffering. It undermines the fight against Daesh. It threatens European security. For all these reasons, the European Council on Friday again urged Turkey to end its military action, to withdraw its forces and to respect international humanitarian law. As you know, the European Council will remain seized of this matter. Meanwhile, the European Union remains engaged in efforts to address the serious humanitarian and refugee crisis in light of evolving needs. We insist on the full, unimpeded and safe access of humanitarian workers responding to people in need of urgent, life-saving assistance to be granted by any and all parties on the ground. Protection of civilians must remain an absolute priority. Now, regarding the so-called Sochi agreement last night, the de-escalation of hostilities in the north-east Syria will hopefully save lives and prevent further civilian suffering. To this extent, we welcome it as an attempt to achieve an end to the current cycle of violence. We can expect it to take some time before the consequences of the agreement reached in Sochi to play out. However, one thing has not changed, that what is needed to end the Syria conflict on a permanent basis is an overarching political settlement for the whole of Syria, negotiated by the Syrians for the Syrians, in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. All parties must come to the table in Geneva at the end of this month, and from there build a lasting solution. Allow me to express my appreciation for your continuing commitment to seeing a peaceful resolution to the long-running Syria conflict. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Minister Tuppurainen, and also my thanks to Commissioner Stylianides, who has been with us for the debate and listening closely to it. The debate is closed. We will vote on a resolution. We've received 7 motions for resolutions to wind up this debate. It will take place tomorrow. The votes will follow shortly. Thank you.